Automatic recording. Great. I'm just making sure this is working as we go. Hello, everyone. I am Lynn Carpenter from the Reading League New York, and I am so excited, as I know many of you are who are watching live and who are watching the recording, to welcome Dr. Marnie Ginsberg. We have close to 1,000 people who registered for this event this evening, so I know that this is a topic that is of interest to a lot of us. So I'm just going to do a brief intro for Dr. Ginsberg, and then I'm just going to turn it over to her so we can get started. This event, once again, is coming from the Reading League New York. We are one of the state chapters of the Reading League. Dr. Marnie Ginsberg is the founder of Reading Simplified, whose mission is to support busy, overwhelmed teachers learn a research-based system of effective and efficient instruction that accelerates all students' reading achievement. Marnie's surprise at finding so many of the middle school students in her classroom reading well below their grade spurred a passion for finding and disseminating solutions. What followed included private tutoring, university research, the creation of an evidence-based reading program, and ultimately the development of Reading Simplified. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ginsberg. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. And thanks to the Reading League of New York and all of you who are interested in this topic. I think it is very cool. And I hope that by the time we're done, you think it is as cool as I do. I think it's cool because I did not learn about this in my undergrad, my master's, or my doctorate in reading. And yet it's now becoming one of the most frequently included measures in recent reading research. So there's something there, and I want to explore that with you. How many of you learned about set for variability in college? I would love to see the chat on that question. Yes? Why? No? We're going to be talking today about the second decoding strategy you need to know, set for variability. And I've got so much packed in, so I think we should get moving, but I'd love to see that chat. Did you hear about set for variability in college at all?
So chat is disabled, so you can put it in Q&A.
Oh, I'm
Apologies for
sorry.
that.
Okay, I gotcha.
So
Thank you.
that's my mix up. And I apologize also, as you're going, if you have any questions while we're going through, while Dr. Ginsberg's talking, please feel free to put them in the Q&A.
Okay, we've got a big fat no all the way down. Christina's lucky. She's heard of it, but almost no one has heard about it. So hopefully this will be of use to you guys. Let's jump in. I'm going to share a gift with you at the end, a link to get some slides on how to give feedback, and they even have hyperlinks to watch videos. And because set for variability is really all mostly tied tightly to how to give feedback, and also for those of you who are reading nerds, there'll be references for the set for variability articles that I've used. And now I want to play this game. How many of you have heard of the game Incoherent? It's a fun game. If you want to play it with kids, I encourage you to check out the family version. So what you do is you draw a card and you read it, but it's not going to make any sense. So you have to figure out how to change the way you read it to turn it into a phrase that actually seems like a real phrase. Are you with me? So read this out loud to yourself and then figure out what could this mean? Can you type it in the Q&A? It's not going to be a classic Q&A. Oh my gosh, somebody was really fast. Shasta, nice job. She's demonstrating set for variability of a form. Way to go, Shelley. The first pronunciation that you tried, Dick, Doc, Fay, Miss, that's not right. And you needed to correct it. And so you switched into TikTok famous. That is the oral version. Well, actually the reading version of set for variability. Here's another one. Well, there's the right answer. Okay. One more. Are you ready? Go. Oh, nice, Ashley. And Shelley's fast again. It's complicated. That's it. Hid scum plug hated. You obviously have to play around with the sounds and words, and you have to connect it with meaning. And that's what you're doing with set for variability. So set for variability is a skill that a reader uses to transform a pronunciation error into the correctly decoded form. Another nicer way maybe for us to go here and tell your teacher friends, maybe it's easier to use the definition of mispronunciation correction. If you're a reading teacher, you see kids making, well, even if you're not a reading teacher, if you're a teacher of any kind, you have kids reading, they're going to be making reading errors, right? And so when they come across the word said and they say said, they've got to go from said to said. You've seen those errors before, right? Well, they need to apply this strategy of set for variability to go from said to said, just like Shelley did to get to TikTok famous. So here's what I want to share with you today. I think set for variability is important because it is strongly related to many word reading measures. And there's growing research to show that it may be a second important decoding step. So we're not talking about it in a lot of our reading programs. So that's why it's important. And third, what we might want to shift our instruction based on set for variability and some other movements in the field, like statistical learning and self-teaching theory. So how many of you have a reading program that basically has this model? It's not 3Qing anymore, thank goodness. But even in a systematic phonics world, there's still some things we need to improve on because this is the typical model, and research is saying maybe not. First, you want to recognize letter sounds, then you put those letter sounds together by blending, and then you identify the word. Is that an equation, so to speak, that your reading program is depending on? I would love to know. Have you seen that kind of thing, either with a current program or ones you've used in the past? Okay, I'm getting some yeses from Megan and Lisa and Jill. Thank you. Well, we need to expand on that. But you can see here, this is like an IES practice guide. They're like the pinnacle here in the US anyway of synthesizing the results and the research. And they say, number one, teach students to blend letter sounds and sound spelling patterns from left to right within a word to produce a recognizable pronunciation. That is basically the formula that you just saw here. And it is gold. We need to do that all the time. We need to teach kids the phonics and we need to teach them how to put things together. But that's not enough in English, especially because English is so dang complicated. Like the said example, why isn't AI saying A? So this is the formula that I'd like for you to leave with. This is the only math we're doing today, okay? Let's plug in there after learning the letter sounds and blending the sounds, set for variability. Use set for variability. Use the strategy, like Carrie writes, to try for the real word. And that's especially important because kids don't, maybe they don't have the skill yet, or the words are hard, like the word said if you're a beginner. And Elbro and his colleagues in 2012 even had this in the title. Is this a second step in word decoding? And I've been teaching reading for over 25 years, and I have indeed found this to be an important strategy and step in my clinical practice. So that's one reason why I really caught on to this. So let's see an example of set for variability in action. So hopefully the audio will work. This is I think it's a kindergarten reader who is going to try to read the word guess. And she hasn't been taught GU before. She hasn't been taught the word guess before. So she's going to say g, and then she's going to flip right into guess. So it's going to go fast, but look for that. So why would that be set for variability? Because she realized g is not going to get me anywhere, but she probably read the S in the ending in her mind, but just didn't say it out loud. That's what I'm guessing. And so she made that flip. And so this is just one example of set for variability in action.
No. You cannot look the Guess, guess.
Nice figuring out there. Guess.
Were you able to hear it? Awesome. So that was so fast. And I was a teacher in that example. I didn't give her any cue. I just let her do that work. That's the strategy of taking a mispronunciation. In her mind, she was probably coming up with guess, and then she's like, that's not going to work. I'm going to switch over to guess. So it's more than just recognizing the letter sounds and blending. Now, the reason I'm especially excited about this is because I never heard of it before. There were some inklings of it in the past, but then it kind of just got shelved. So there was a study in 1963, which was reported again in a very influential reading textbook by Gibson and Levin in 1975. And the results from that study, they suggest that teaching children initially to expect one-to-one constant mappings of letters to sounds is not an effective way to promote transfer in decoding at later stages of learning to read. So that's an important part. One-to-one mappings is not an effective way to promote transfer. And do you know what they mean there? One-to-one, like one letter, one sound. I call that short vowel world because cat and hat and him and son, they're predictable. The S in son is always, going to be one letter. The S-U-N, 3 sounds, 3 letters. That's one-to-one mapping. For sure, most programs, practically all that I know, their phonics start there, but when they stay too long there, that may be a problem, according to Gibson and Levin. And then they say, the nature of the correspondence system should be revealed as soon as possible if transfer is to happen. How many of you are frustrated when you teach some phonics, maybe further down the line, O, OA, OW, and then you don't see the transfer? Well, it could be that there's something at play here with how long we stay in one-to-one mapping. So I want to keep poking at that because I think it's an opportunity for improving our systems. And then, okay, so that was quiet for a while. Whole language is taking over. In 1999, an influential reading researcher, Richard Vanetsky, wrote in The American Way of Spelling, in learning decoding patterns, children must acquire what Gibson and Levin call a set for variability. That is, if one pronunciation does not produce a known word that makes sense for the context, a child has to try a different pronunciation. Why some children acquire this set for diversity or variability quickly and others only after great effort remains a mystery. So he's validating that old idea and then saying that there's something going on there, but we don't really know a lot about it. And then here's an important take home that we're going to see as a thread throughout our presentation today. Just a simple how to do it, how to support kids. And Vanetsky says, teachers should try modeling how to figure out a word through decoding, producing first a non-word, just like I did with SAID, and then through successive refinement, the correct word. Students should be asked repeatedly, what other sounds could that letter or digraph, etc., have? Or do you know a word in which it has a different sound? So it's asking these prompts of the student when you're in the middle of reading, what else could this be? That's a nutshell of how to put this into action tomorrow. So so far we're just talking about the history, and I'm going to pivot now to, based on that history and the theory that they're presenting, is to suggest my personal opinion based on the theory. And I'm going to come back to this again, but I think our contemporary systematic phonics scope and sequences are ignoring this advice that they're spending too much time in one-to-one mapping, and they're not really teaching kids the nature of the code as early as they should. Remember, that was one of the points in Gibson and Levin's seminal book. The nature of the correspondence system should be revealed as soon as possible. So if you are spending a whole year in kindergarten or as a reading interventionist and it takes you 9 months to get out a short vowel land where you work on CVC and then CVCC words like help, held, and must, and CCVC words like stop and block, and CCVCC words like stomp, and 6-sound words like sprint, all with short vowels. If you do that for a whole year, you're staying in a one-to-one mapping for the whole year. You're not teaching the nature of the code, nor are you giving them enough data about the code, because set for variability is based on having knowledge of the code. So Diane McGinnis in Why Our Children Can't Read from the 90s emphasized the importance of not just staying in one-to-one mapping. And all the programs that I've used and developed have been built off of her work. So I really admire her. She says these are the things that you need to understand about the code. And number 1 through 3, these are things that we teach when we're teaching systematic phonics, even at that short vowel world level or the one-to-one mapping. We teach symbolization, that letters are pictures or representations of sounds in speech. This is like the alphabetic principle. Almost all phonics programs does that. Transitivity. The letter B is B in the beginning, the middle, or the end of a word. Most good systematic phonics programs are going to do that even at those early stages. Reversibility, that you need to be able to decode and encode in their reversible processes. All of that is great, but it's not folding in these other things that are really important parts of our code. Spelling alternatives, the sound O. It would be nice, if we were teaching Spanish, our job would be a lot easier. The O sound is not just one spelling. It's O as in go, and O as in home, and O as in show, and O as in boat, and O as in toe, and O as in though. And then we also have code overlaps. Like the EA could be E or or A. So those are things that are basically part of the code, nature of our code that she's revealing. And they don't exist in a lot of reading programs at the beginning because of that one-to-one mapping issue. So if we could get to this level faster, I think we'd be able to prepare our students for set for variability. So I'm just basing that on clinical experience and also some of the literature, the theories that undergird how it is we're going to see the transfer, like Gibson and Levin's point. When you are going to demonstrate set for variability, you need these things. An understanding of the true understanding of our nature of our code, and it needs to be beyond just the alphabetic principle and the one-to-one level, one-to-one mapping level. And you also need a lot of exposures. Because if you're going to know to switch say to said, you need to maybe know that there's another possibility. And Marty's asking a great question. How do dyslexic children remember so many options? It is very challenging. It's more challenging for them, for sure. But it is something doable. So this is just my opinion based on the literature. In the Reading Simplified world, we move from CVC, short vowel words. So if they can blend 3 sound words, then we go straight into 3 sound long vowel words, so we can give them this exposure more quickly, and they don't get diluted into thinking that, oh, it's always one letter, one sound. This is not based on direct experimental evidence. It's simply based on the theories and then my clinical experience. And here in the Streamlined Pathway in Reading Simplified, see, this is down here, steps 1 through 4, we would be working at short vowels, 3 sounds. Once they can nail 3 sounds, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, then we get into what we call advanced phonics, and they're going to do O, its various spellings, and E, its various spellings. So that's just something to poke at you and looking at your curriculum and think about, how might I adjust this if I want to get better at preparing my students for set for variability? And a thing that's important to understand that ties in really tightly with set for variability is another theory that's been around since the 90s called Scher's self-teaching theory. And his theory is that none of us have been explicitly taught the 20, 30, 40, 50,000 words that we know as adult readers. Instead, he says you just need 3 things to be able to teach yourself to have a generative skill at figuring out unknown words when you attack them, when you encounter them. You need sufficient phonics knowledge, sufficient phonemic awareness, and a decoding strategy, or maybe more than one. Those are 3 things you need. And then you put them together and you come to the word said and you say said, and you're like, maybe you're by yourself and you figure it out yourself. Or maybe you're with a teacher and she just taps the AI and says, what else could that be? Or try eh. And between the two, it's still a lot of work going on in your head as a developing reader. You're teaching yourself or teaching yourself with the support of the teacher. And this is one of his important, examples to show why it's not possible. By the time you reach high school, you probably know, graduate from high school, you probably know about 20,000 words if you're a typically developing reader, maybe much more. You just couldn't have learned that much. That would mean each teacher's teaching you, oodles and oodles of words every single day in school. So it's just not feasible. There has to be another explanation. This is not to say that we don't need to be explicitly taught phonics. That's indisputable. So we need this information. It's just a question of how much do we as teachers have to cover, how much do we have to control, and how much does the student have to generate on his or her own? And that's a tension that I think we should be feeling more with our curriculum. Dr. Ann Cunningham is a very influential reading researcher as well. She's written several times with Keith Stanovich, and she writes along these same lines. And the complexity of the orthography or our spelling system can be built upon, so that once you've got that kind of basic consonant, vowel, consonant core, you can add vowels that are more complex and different orthographic sequences that children have difficulty with because they have an anchor, the anchor being this three sound words. They have something to hang it on with, this core consonant, vowel, consonant sequence. So she's wanting us to move, past that CBC to add in the tricky vowels, which is, I think, which is the message that I'm trying to pass along today. So Scherer, even though he didn't use set for variability in 95, he did say basically the same concept. He said, how are you going to be able to do this generative thing? Well, it depends on partial decoding, on phonemic awareness, and sensitivity to contextual constraints, and the reader's willingness to test multiple alternative pronunciations for goodness of fit. So that's what set for variability is. You're testing alternate pronunciations. Now let's get into the modern world and back into science, really much more concretely with experiments. So we saw that was happening in our history, but it kind of went silent. And then in 98 and 2012, Tunmer and Chapman came up with a test of set for variability, which we didn't really have before, or at least it wasn't popularized. And so they used this oral test, not that dissimilar to the beginning game that we played, Incoherent. And that then becomes like the operationalized way of a researcher measuring whether set for variability is impacting other things. Because it's, as you can see, when we did that, to come up with TikTok famous, you had to read the letter sounds, you had to blend them, you had to play around with the sounds, you had to know meaning, you had to know the expression of TikTok famous. All of that is a lot of different pieces, as you know, that reading is complex. So to be able to take one little component of the system out, they have to have some kind of isolated test. So it's operationalized as this oral only test. So let's play this game. This is how researchers have been doing it in recent papers. Let's play. I'm going to talk to you like you're one of my students, okay? In a set for variability measure. Let's play a word game with Alex. Okay, Alex is going to say a word, but it's going to sound funny. Try to guess what word Alex means. Okay, ready? You guys can put in the answer. The word is mother. All right, you guys are fast typers. The next one is breakfast. You got it, mother and breakfast. So that is set for variability, the oral version that scientists are doing, and it's turning out to be really predictive of a lot of stuff. And this, when I first saw this in the literature, I was blown away because I started my doctoral program in the early 2000s, and I actually was reading mostly a lot about phonological awareness and how it relates to word reading. And I never heard about this. And I was always so many of the papers have phonological awareness in them, hundreds, thousands. And they almost always say it's the #1 predictor of early reading, which back then was a really big deal because almost in almost all other educational areas, mothers education and socioeconomic status is a much stronger predictor, or IQ, but phonemic awareness for early kids, especially young readers, is a #1 predictor. Sometimes people say along with letter sounds or letter names, but it was just everywhere. And there was no such thing as set for variability. And now, just in the last 5 years, we've found out all these things that set for variability, that skill that we just did to come up with breakfast or mother, it predicts general word reading. It also predicts irregular word reading. So it's not just about the words, funky words like said, it's even about your ability to read word like happy, which is pretty regular. And there we got regular words. And it's also just this year, just the last month or so, it's been demonstrated to predict responsiveness to tier 2 instruction. So this is a lot. So far, based on what we've talked about, what does your intuition tell you set for variability is most related to? Like, what cognitive domain? Oral language, context. Good, good. This is, what else, you guys? It's we did it orally, right? Background knowledge, vocabulary. Okay, this is what people, of course, I love this. Thank you guys. This is what people come up with first when you're just playing, when you're thinking about it, because I gave you an oral task. Surely it's because you knew the word mother really well that you moved into that. But I want to challenge you on this, the whole idea of vocabulary and language being the main driver. There's something else going on here, and we're not aware of it because we are readers. And readers' minds have been transformed to see orthography of words. We can't even hear them orally only anymore. Like they're inextricably linked. When I say mother, at some level, your brain is also thinking MOTHER. You cannot separate oral language and spelling anymore. And so let me show you why I think it's important we understand it's just way more than vocabulary. Check out the next slide. Set for variability also predicts nonsense word reading. What does nonsense word reading have to do with vocabulary? Nothing, because they're nonsense, right? So what is going on? Hopefully we'll get into it further as we get into this. It's not just vocabulary, and I'm going to show you why. This is a really cool study by Stacy and Edwards and colleagues at Florida State University. They're doing a lot of the cutting edge research on this. And they say that the relationship between reading and set for variability is explained this way. Quote, the results suggest that set for variability accounts for a significant amount of unique variance in word reading over and above other important early predictors of reading. Like what I used to talk about. I was always thinking phonemic awareness was one of the early predictors. Comparatively, the additional variance explained by set for variability was much larger than that explained by PA. Well, they use phonemic awareness measure in that test. When competed against other predictors of word reading, set for variability was the strongest predictor, completely dominating phonemic awareness, rapid automatized naming, vocabulary, and attention. Sorry, my webcam just gives me stars when I raise 2 fingers. Here, this just blows me away. Again, remember, I was trained in phonemic awareness is the strongest predictor of early reading ability. Stacy, and this is not, they're not the only ones to say this, but they probably did the best early, now 2 years old, but it's early in this history. Set for variability accounted for 50% unique variance in word reading above and beyond other predictors, whereas phonological awareness accounted for only 1%. That's a big difference. Now, these are 2nd through 5th graders, and a lot of the studies are, not K and 1, although the Savage study is coming up is, I think, 1st grade. So in that same article, they found these correlations. So phonemic awareness is correlated with set for variability at 0.66. Correlation is like showing the strength and the direction of the relationship. So it's 1 to 1, up 1.0 would be like a perfect relationship. 0.66 is pretty high. But notice what's lower, but still strong. 0.5 vocabulary. So you and I, and maybe I would have had this, I can't remember what my first impulse was, but many of us had this first impulse that the set for variability task that we just did, it was heavily dominated by language and vocabulary. This is suggesting, well, first of all, it's more related to phonemic awareness than language. And then attention is also important. You can't do this task without paying attention to what the word is. But there's something missing in this box. Guess what is most highly correlated? Word identification. And that goes back to what I was trying to say earlier, why our brains as readers have been transformed. We can't just think of words orally anymore. We're inextricably thinking about print. Even when I'm talking to you orally and I say mother, some of your brain is processing the symbols, mother, what symbols you would tie to that and how you're going to switch it into. So it's kind of amazing, and it's so subconscious, we don't even know it. We think we're just doing a vocabulary activity, but if this is a super high correlation, 0.79, practically 0.8. That means these are really tightly correlated, in other words. And maybe that's why it's showing up more strongly for second grade and up. It's still early days because those are kids that have actually started to get the code ingrained in their mind, whereas a kindergarten kid might not. So what's going on in the reader's mind? Let's talk about it in terms of the triangle model of reading. How many of you are familiar with this work? Often cited by Seidenberg and McClelland. Other people have expanded upon it. Their theory of this model is that we are learning to read words through the interaction of these three domains, especially semantics or meaning and vocabulary, phonology, sounds, and orthography, print, spelling. Those are things that work all together, and we're just seeing how, when we do this task, we're seeing how they're interrelated and they're hard to disentangle. The model makes it look simple, but they didn't mean for it to be this unilateral or, one direction. It's not, and nor this simple. They have these additional layers showing things are kind of in flux, and there's a lot of things that are dynamic, and there's a phonological cleanup process when you're attacking an unknown word. So when you come to the word mother and you realize, that's not right, your phonology and your semantics are kind of like, problem. You need a phonological cleanup. So to me, it's interesting that they say phonological because what do you have to do to change mother into mother? You have to drop out O and put in a. And that's a phonological phoneme manipulation task. So a recent study that just came out by Edwards and Stacy and colleagues, actually it's in preprint, but it's recent, and I think they've made a nice contribution here. They say the relationship between set for variability and word reading was significantly moderated by a word's spelling to pronunciation transparency rating. In other words, hat would have an easy transparency score, whereas the word aisle, AISLE, that would have a high negative transparency rating. And also a child's decoding skill. Obviously, a 5-year-old's not as good at decoding as a 10-year-old in general. Specifically, set for variability was shown to be more important under conditions that may lead to a partial decoding, such as when decoding skills are low or words are irregular. So just to reiterate that, basically, you and I need set for variability for these two reasons. Sometimes we may have limited decoding skill. So that's a kindergarten student, if they've always been in a one-to-one mapping situation and you throw at them the word although, they have limited decoding skills, right? They've never heard that O-U-G-H could be one sound. But it's also true that some words are just less transparent. And so that's going to make you need to rely on set for variability more. So hat is not very hard. That's, that you probably don't need set for variability that much unless you don't know, if you have weak decoding skill. Have is slightly harder, right? Because you might expect this A-E to have an A sound and it doesn't. But of course, that's not nearly as challenging as the sounds in the word aisle. These are two examples they use. So there's a progression of difficulty. And so these are the two places where you're going to see this need for set for variability crop up. For those of you who teach kindergarten, first grade, second grade, or anyone who's struggling, you're going to have number one all the time, right? Because your kids have limited decoding skill at this point in time before you get started with intervention. Kearns and his colleagues in 2016 was thinking that this set for variability really connects the phonological processes. And I agree, there's certainly an important element, but then there was another study that came out in 2019 that said, yeah, we agree, but we speculate that there is also an orthographic or spelling component. And that just hopefully takes you back to the triangle: semantics, orthography, and phonology. So I think there's a lot to be, a lot of weight on the OP angle of the triangle, the orthographic to phonological, because that's where word identification is. And remember, word identification was the highest correlation. So that's a little bit about the history, why it's important, why I'm kind of surprised that it, like, I didn't know about it, and now it's coming, it's exploding. It's to be more predictive than phonemic awareness for second grade and up is kind of blows my mind. And now there's some early experimental evidence, like, can we actually teach this strategy? So I'm going to go through some experiments on this. Zipke was one of the first in 2016. She only did 5 short lessons with 15 beginning readers, and she just tried to get them to try a different sound when they had a mispronunciation. And it did indeed yield more attempts with unknown words, but the outcomes were not transferable to standardized tests and words that they hadn't been taught. And but that was a good first step. But you know, it was only 5 lessons, so what could you expect? I think these prompts are very good, and they're really tightly related to what I've done at the targeted reading intervention at Reading Simplified. And it kind of reminds me of what Vanetsky said. You might ask, is there another way to say that? What other sounds does that letter make? Try saying it another way. Do you know another sound for the letter or or whatever? Probably not. What's another word that sounds something like that? Oops. So those are, I like those prompts. And if you stick around the end, I'll send you a link where you can get some prompts that are similar to this that we use regularly at Reading Simplified. So it's tentative. It's promising, but just very tentative. Then Dyson, the next year, did an intervention with set for variability with 160 minutes. So it's a little bit more young children, 5 to 7. And she did set for variability with vocabulary instruction. Again, this kind of comes back to what you guys were thinking. Like, if this is, it must be a vocabulary activity. That's why they put this into their intervention. And it did yield effects for the trained word identification and vocabulary, but not for transfer to standardized tests. And this is very common in literature. You can teach someone to do better at the specific words you've used, but not necessarily just generic, the broad bank of words that you might find in a standardized test. So it's just not quite the same level of transfer. So here's what they did. Say the word out loud, decide if you've read or heard that word before, think of a word that you know that sounds like this, choose a word that sounds similar, check to see if the word makes sense. So this is not that dissimilar to the previous intervention, but then they also included vocabulary. I think it's important to do that as an experiment, but really it's kind of muddying the waters, because it's not just focusing on the set for variability strategy, it's teaching vocabulary. So it's getting, what's the direct thing that causes the change? It's harder to say. They did conclude, though, it is relatively easy to teach children the strategies that allow them to correct their mispronunciation of irregular words. And that's interesting. They were still focusing on irregular words. That's kind of the history of this. Initially, that was what was thought was where you need it, with words like said, not words like hat. How many of you have seen this with your own students, that you say, well, what other sound could that be? Or can you try another sound? Or that is not probably unfamiliar to all of you. I just want to oh, good, Joy, you've seen it. I want to embolden you to use it more and maybe think more about how you can develop it today. Then Savage and his colleagues in 2018 came out with a different study first graders, and it was 10 hours over 10 weeks. And they did an experimental condition of what they call direct mapping and set for variability versus the control condition of best practices. Direct mapping meant teaching letter sounds, teaching phoneme grapheme relationships, and then also reading texts that would practice that particular sound. So if they were focusing on short A, they would read short A text. And they taught set for variability, kind of like we've seen before. What else could have this strategy of one sound? If it doesn't work, try another. So this experimental condition showed immediate higher word reading and spelling. And it even had better word reading and sentence and comprehension 5 months post-test, which is a nice milestone to hit because it probably means that it was like not just a passing thing. So this is interesting that they actually got better effects, but it's also kind of muddy because they put in more than just set for variability. They trained in phonics. So which part? It could have been the combination, or it could have been just one part. So when they taught set for variability, they taught primary vowel digraphs like OA or EA or AI. Well, maybe not AI. Yeah, there's a couple of different variations on AIs, and they're obviously with the set example. And then their variations. So they taught the vowel, the primary, and its variation. Like for EA, they would probably have taught E as in each first, and then as in head, and dead and bread, and A as in steak. And they would teach them to flip the vowel. Tracy's used that strategy. Good. They mentioned that it's important to note that they were really emphasizing that they were teaching a strategy. And that's why it's important to have that new formula, not just, oh, it's letter sounds plus blending equals a word. No, you actually have to add another strategy, not just blending. Blending is essential strategy, but there's a second decoding strategy to be able to do this flipping, especially in a language like English where there's so many unpredictable vowels. Now, Stacy Elliman, Lovett, and colleagues, they in 2016 studied set for variability in the context of Maureen Lovett's work. She's been doing strategy on phonics in general, and specifically how to cope with variable vowels, where like EA could be 3 sounds. And so they teach this vowel alert strategy. I think this is cute. So this is what you do. You stop at the vowel you're unsure of. That's the red light. Be careful and try both vowel sounds, yellow light, and go when I get the correct word, green light. So you might like to use that as an analogy. They did this with older students, 3rd through 6th graders. They did the FAST, which was the strategy version, plus traditional phonics instruction. And the FAST kids did better with variable vowels, EA, OW, but it didn't transfer over into better outcomes overall. So it was kind of incremental. It was like promising, but not quite a slam dunk. And then in 22, also we had Colin Brander and colleagues work with 85 kindergarten children. This is interesting, but it's also kind of low dose, just 12 irregular words and 3 sessions. They had 3 conditions: look and spell. So you look at the word, said, and you spell it. And MPC, which I forgot what that is now. I'm so sorry. Oh, right up there, mispronunciation correction. Yeah. Okay. So you try said and it doesn't work. Try said. So that teaching that specific strategy versus look and say. Here's the word said. Say said. And then of course there was a control group. There was no difference between the look and spell and the mispronunciation. So that's interesting that the strategy of try one, try another wasn't any better than just spelling out the words, but both of them are analyzing the inside parts of words, which look and say isn't. And again, it was no generalization to untrained words. So we've gotten some promising early signs that when we do this as teachers, we're probably going to make change, but it's not been a slam dunk. And I think a lot of this has to do maybe with the fact that the interventions haven't been as efficient maybe as they could be, and they haven't been of enough intensity. That's my personal opinion. So here's how they did the mispronunciation intervention in the Collenbrander et al. Study. Okay, I'm going to sound this word out. Wash. You sound it out with me. Wash. Is wash a word you know? When I show the green light, tell me yes or no. So green light. Okay, the kids say, no, wash is not a real word. Wash doesn't mean anything. So wash is not a real word, but it does sound a bit like a word we know. Just think about it. Don't tell me. And then the teacher says, yes, it does. The word is actually wash. Wash. Can you say it? Wash. Good job. Say it again. The word is wash. So the teacher's going through this back and forth, but she's not tying it here in mispronunciation to the sounds and symbols, phonemes, graphings, which we'd know from other research would probably be stronger. Also, I have another question for you. Thinking about what's going on in that script, who is doing the work? Gail, Mim, yeah, the teacher, Jackie, Valise. When the teacher's doing the work, the student isn't, and we're missing opportunity to really engage their mind. So I would like to see some of these interventions push more onto the student's responsibility, connect sounds and symbols. And here's one that just came out and we're almost done with the experiments. Dunn and colleagues worked with 2nd and 3rd grade students with reading difficulties. Now, this was 25 hours of phonics. Both conditions had the same 25 hours of phonics, and then they had 5 hours of the experiment. One group had set for variability, and one group had 5 hours of morphology, kind of like structured word inquiry. And they found that there was actually no difference. Both of them grew a lot. These are pretty strong effect sizes, but there was no difference between set for variability and the morphology study. So that's interesting. So I went through the main experiments where they try to change student set for variability and get outcomes. And we saw mixed results. But I think there's other ways of looking at it to know that there's other suggestions of what might be effective. So Savage's research, especially done here and the previous one from 2018, I believe, they were doing multi-component. So they weren't just teaching set for variability strategy, they were also teaching phonics, letter sound knowledge, and they were having kids read words. So I would call that a multi-component research study. And we did the same thing back in the day for me when we were developing the targeted reading intervention. And I did not know the term set for variability, but I did put that strategy into this reading intervention, mostly probably because of my clinical background. I can't actually remember. So the targeted reading intervention has been studied since in depth since, well, we started in 2005. And one of the earliest studies was in the elementary school journal, and we got effect sizes of 0.4 to 0.7 in all 4 domains that we used. So it was effective altogether, but we weren't just looking at set for variability. So that's why I'm saying it's multi-component. We were training the teachers, we were giving them phonics lessons, we're teaching them how to meet the kids' needs diagnostically, and one of the strategies happened to be set for variability. But it worked. There's a lot of research on it. Here is the model that I taught in the targeted reading intervention for word identification development. The colorful line is kind of the decoding line. And you can see here, one of the early strategies that we're teaching is the ability to blend. But then after we taught them to blend, we would make sure the teacher was helping them do the try one sound strategy. And can anyone guess what strategy that was? It kind of sounds just like what we've been doing, say, no, A doesn't work. I'm going to try oh, said. I'm trying one sound. If it doesn't work, trying another. And I'm flipping my phonemes in that case. So I built it into the targeted reading intervention and it was effective, but it was just one of many things we did. So that's not a slam dunk, but it is suggested that maybe the things in the targeted reading intervention helped. And that's one way of thinking about doing set for variability. And here's a little bit more about the various years of that. It's on the What Works Clearinghouse, and many organizations that analyze experimental evidence and interventions have validated it. And also in evidence for ESSA, which is kind of like the What Works Clearinghouse, they report effect sizes of the studies they've analyzed, and the targeted reading intervention has one of the highest effect sizes, even though it was only about 5 hours for a typical struggling reader, which is a really low dose, right? So it's a pretty big deal to get over 0.5 effect size for just 5 hours. So it's an effective intervention in general based on the experiments. But again, set for variability was just one of many components. I also put the same thing in again before I knew the term set for variability. I put it into reading simplified based on my experience developing the targeted reading intervention. Here you can see first we teach blending, and then we teach flex it, which is just another term I developed to represent set for variability. I like what Emily says. I think the benefit is when the strategy becomes a habit, that the student has habitualized the thought process of being able to flex the sound. So true. And that can happen from day one of our instruction, even when these kids don't know anything about the code. And Reading Simplified doesn't have any experimental evidence yet, but we have a couple of evaluations from American Institutes for Research, and they have shown some really profound growth. But again, Reading Simplified is not just about set for variability. That's just one piece of the puzzle. So this 2 schools here just last year saw a 40% growth on their DIBELs in their implementation of Reading Simplified. So we've covered the experiments, and now let's talk about with set for variability, let's talk about what's that going to mean for your instruction tomorrow or next week. So I think it's an opportunity for us to make diagnostic and instructional enhancements. So now I'm going to be talking more about my opinion based on the set for variability research and other theories, which are really, really robust and have a good research base, but I don't think they're always getting put into practice into a lot of our systematic phonics programs. So I'm using science and theory to come up with these, but also my clinical experience. So these are some of my tips. Remember what Gibson and Levin said from the beginning. If more than one phoneme is represented by a single grapheme, the child should be introduced to both correspondences very early in training. Again, that's why I'm saying let's abandon one-to-one mapping as fast as we can so that they can get what Emily was talking about, this habituation. You can't have the habituation if it's always very predictable what the code says. So here's one strategy. I bet you guys have used it. I just want to kind of label it. Hey, this is a set for variability strategy. When you have kids cut up words or sort them somehow, these are all words that have the OW spelling, but it can be OOW as in the O in go, like the word slow or show, or we could sort it into the ow as in cow. So just sorting one spelling, multiple sounds is a way to get kids to realize, oh, this is how the code works, and I'm going to put this strategy into action. So here's an activity that you could do. These are all OW. Is it ow or is it O? And you can do this with other sounds, like all the individual vowels. A can be A or A, and even
Okay.
But also EA is a good one, like we mentioned before. The other really easy thing is to coach this in connected text. And again, I hope we can do it from even when our little readers are baby readers and they can barely read hat, we can still coach them. When they get to hat and they say A, maybe because they can't remember the sound and all they know is the letter name, which happens, right? We just point to that A and say, could be, what else could that be? So when they're at their very beginning part of their word reading development, you can still be coaching set for variability in connected text or in reading, in reading a word card. So you're probably already doing that. I just want to validate it, label it, and make you more aware that you're doing it. You're teaching the second most important decoding strategy, in my opinion. So here's an example of a boy who's, I think he's upper elementary. He's 2 years behind-ish, and he's reading a text, which is kind of hard for him. He's going to read this word patriot. I think he first says parrot, and then I make him read each chunk, and he comes with pay, try, oat. And notice I'm not saying a lot, but he's going to do the work. And this is him using set for variability in the context of connected text.
Tread the streets. Alex became
Alex became
a parrot, a at patriot, patriot oat.
Good try.
Patriot?
Nice fixing. I like how you did that. He became a patriot. What does that mean?
I don't know.
It's someone who's faithful to in this case. All right. So parrot, patriot, patriot. Do you know what that is? No. So he came up with patriot without me saying any of the vowel sounds. And even though he didn't know the meaning, and that is not uncommon because he, as a native English speaker, he had probably heard that word at some deep recesses of his mind. So it's in his phonological memory that it's probably patriot. Or maybe it sounds like an English word. Back to what Emily's talking about with the stress of different syllables. And so then, of course, I gave him a vocabulary definition of it. But it's kind of cool. Think about it. He didn't even know the meaning, but he still decoded it with a lot of support, of course. But the scaffolding was not about, certainly didn't just give him the word. And I didn't even give him, oh, try A here. Now, you certainly can go and say, try A here, but I was trying to lay back and first let him do as much work as he could, and then only provide what was needed after frustration. So here's my general from least to most feedback that I typically try to follow. I want to put the burden of the work onto the student and let them surprise me that they may know more than I think. So if they come to the word patriot and they say patriot, I can just tap the A. And the tapping is a nonverbal way to maybe give them the opportunity to fix it themselves. Okay, that's step number one, the least kind of feedback. Probably the least feedback. Maybe I should put 0 is just to like do nothing and just wait for him to figure it out. Number 2 would be tap the A. What else could this be? You haven't given him the answer, but you're just prompting him with a strategy, right? Number 3 would be you're kind of giving him a lot of the answer. You're not giving the word patriot. You're just saying, well, try A. Now, if all of that fails and they've worked hard, don't frustrate them indefinitely. We'll say, this is the word patriot. And I still would tie sounds and symbols. That's you can see the threads from those experiments into here, but I just like this hierarchy of the least to the most so that the student is doing the work. And I think some of that emphasis on the student doing the work and analyzing the sound symbol relationships is missing in some of those experiments. And that may be why we haven't seen outstanding results yet. So even though set for variability is an oral test for scientists, that doesn't mean that you're supposed to teach it in isolation. Remember, reading is actually a connectionist model. The triangle model is a connectionist model, which says that orthography, phonology, and semantics all work together, and seeing the letters is one of the hardest things that kids need to develop. So we don't want to ignore them. So I'm going to do a little modeling of this. I'm going to go through it in steps and it's going to seem linear. It's not that clean. It's very muddy and all these things overlap, but just give me just to kind of get the conceptualization. What if a student comes to the word wasp and reads it as wasp? Reasonable enough, right? So what are the steps that student might do given this connectionist model of reading? Well, first the student's going to think, ah's probably not right. I'm going to throw out. And then I'm going to put in I'm going to put in wasp. Wasp. I know that. And that brings up semantics, meaning, vocabulary. Okay. And now maybe that helps the child solidify it with WASP. The orthography of the spelling is wasp. Now I'm getting I've done it wrong so many times. I'm getting twisted up. Wasp. All of those happen. That it doesn't necessarily happen that linearly, but Those are how all those pieces work together. And then what's built after the student reads was for the first time, second time, third time, 10th time, then the word becomes a sight word, a word recognized in a split second, and all these pieces are interconnected. And when I say wasp to you, you can't even pull out WASP from your mind. It is there forever unless you have a brain injury. That's what, so set for variability requires a strategy, which we talked a lot about. What else could that be? And you want the kid to try to, as Emily pointed out, get that to be their habit. But it also requires orthographic, semantic, and phonological knowledge and skills. The triangle things, all three of those things in the triangle, that you have to have all of them. And I got so excited, I probably covered too much, taking so long. So I might go quickly through this. I talked a little bit about self-teaching theory. And now I want to talk a little bit about statistical learning, because they're all interwoven into this puzzle piece. But I don't have time to really give them a full fleshing out. So bear with me. Go dig into more about statistical learning if this is news to you. Dr. Mark Seidenberg is a very influential reading researcher, and he said, rule-governed words and exceptions occupy points on a statistical continuum that includes many degrees of spelling sound consistency. This clarifies why it's so difficult to list the rules for pronouncing written English. Every reading program has different rules for what the rules are. The system, he says, isn't rule-governed, it's statistical. And this relates to my point earlier about let's get into the advanced code and long vowels earlier, because we need to give them the data. You can't make statistical analysis to know what the pattern is unless you have seen OA multiple times, or EA and you've seen EAD several times in bread and head. And so then when you see it in dead, you guess even though EA, you know, and each is E. So his point is that a lot of our programs imply to us that a word is either irregular or regular, as if it's categorical, black or white, one or the other. And he's saying it's actually not true. It's more of a continuum. So got is super easy, very regular. You know, have is a little less regular, but it's still not that inconsistent. A lot of words end in VE. Said may be considered an exception. And of course, yacht is like a wacky one. So this is a continuum. It's not one or the other. And so we have to see lots of phonics in real words to kind of develop the statistical prediction, like the EA is going to be when I see it with a D at the end. That's only happens from seeing bread, dead, and head. So we've abandoned 3 cueing, and we don't want to prioritize context and syntax. And a lot of the science of reading community is moving over to teaching phonics by referring to a rule, but cutting edge science is telling us it's more likely that we need to teach the statistical patterns, or give students the opportunities to observe the statistical patterns and then to coach them to be flexible. This try one sound strategy set for variability. So again, you can do this from day one, even when your kids are reading something super easy like this. When you get to Sam and they say same, it could be, what else could it be? So you're coaching set for variability, even when they haven't learned tricky vowels yet. Our brains can't detect patterns if they don't encounter sufficient examples. So if we're always living in short vowel world, it's just not going to happen that we're going to know to go to A or So we need lots of information and the tools to get this strategy working. So I've got to wrap up with 3 considerations. Again, based on the experiments and other theories, self-teaching and statistical learning especially, and what Gibson, Levin, and Vanetsky said early on, those things are pointing me towards these suggestions coupled with my clinical practice. Let's think about, when we look at our scope and sequences, are we revealing our written code, how it really works early enough? Are we showing how it functions? Could we give our students faster access to code knowledge? So in Reading Simplified, I will build an early word. So kids might build the word mat, but early on, I'm going to have them build the word that and show that TH is one tile. It's one sound. We don't have to wait for TH or CK or SH for 6 months, because it's not crazy. It's just we have to show them this is how the nature of the code is. One sound could be 2, 3, or 4 letters. We can teach it earlier. You can see this is happening with the literacy hill. She's having a game with the A sound, but multiple spellings. So we're not camping out in short A, and certainly not just AY for 3 weeks and AI 3 weeks later. Kind of revealing the nature of the code quite easily, quite quickly. One sound could have multiple spellings. It happens here with phonic book, decodable books. They've got the sound. The in perfect is different than the in pearl and the in curt. Here in Reading Simplified, we teach the sorted activity. So it's the O sound, and they are different spellings, and we sort them. We already talked about this activity. I just want you to escape short vowel world. Don't camp out there, okay? Yes, thank you about that, Emily. I know I was very great. I was very pleased about that. So what if you could just leap out of short vowel world as soon as kids are kind of getting the hang of it, and then move into long vowel world? When you start reading real text, it's not like the short vowels disappear. You're still going to be doing them. Another idea is for you to lay the foundation for variability with having more phoneme manipulation activities. Because isn't that what you're doing when you're taking out the A and say and replacing it with E? It's phoneme manipulation. And in 2015, Dr. David Kilpatrick wrote this book in this book, Essentials. He did an analysis of highly effective intervention programs. And he looked at a lot of studies that had gotten big bucks from the federal government to do these experiments. And he said, hey, a heck of a lot of them get very minimal results, and only a handful get whopping big results. Why don't we look at these? Just seems like a duh, but it's not really changed a lot of practice. These are the programs that he said were the highly successful programs. Linda Mood, their LIPS program, not the others, Phonographics, and Discover Reading, which is basically these two programs combined in his own version, and then Read, Write, and Type. And then at the time, he said that he thought it was phonemic manipulation was common to all of them, and he developed a phoneme proficiency theory. Now, technically, Read, Write, and Type doesn't actually have that. It has some similarities with these programs, but it's not the same. The program that I originally learned how to teach reading from was Phonographics, and the Targeted Reading Intervention and Reading Simplified have both springboarded from that. So here he said these programs, they have this phoneme proficiency hypothesis, and that is that when kids have really fast or facility with phoneme grapheme mapping and phonemic awareness at really great speed, that's when they're able to get the words to orthographically map. Now, he came out with that, and a lot of people pushed back on it. But now we have some interesting evidence to say he's probably right. So this just came out I think this month or so. These authors, Parkin and colleagues, did an analysis of the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, standardized test. It's kind of hard these are really highly validated measures. And they said that the phoneme proficiency hypothesis posits that efficient responding to phoneme manipulation tasks represents the level of phonemic awareness required to develop orthographic mapping. Again, citing Kilpatrick. Does that make sense? Phoneme manipulation tasks, it's showing what a facility that enables a kid to decode a word to turn it into an orthographically mapped word, a word that becomes a sight word. Many aspects of the results with the Y-4 conform to expectations from the phonemic proficiency hypothesis and provide important validations for interpreting this measure. The phonemic proficiency subtests demonstrated a consistently large effect on pseudo word decoding, which is highly related to word reading, controlling for language. So they have this measure in this achievement test, and it's very predictive of word reading, and it does, and so it probably is true that phonemic proficiency as measured with the phoneme deletion test is probably something that really makes a difference for kids. So take take out your word chaining activities and make them harder and harder phonemically. That's what we do here. It's at Reading Simplified. It's a phonemic manipulation task. Don't camp out in 3 sounds, move to 4 sounds and then 5 sounds and then 6 sounds, and even challenge kids with nonsense words. So you change text to next and so on and so forth. Many programs are doing word chains. A lot of times those programs are emphasizing, let's learn a new phonics bit of information. That's not bad at all, but you can also push their phonemic proficiency by increasing the difficulty of the phonemic awareness task by making it harder and harder to manipulate. And my final consideration for you is, should we rein in how much we control text? Sometimes people brag about, my text is 100% decodable. Well, is that really good? Is that showing the nature of the code to the kid? Is it giving them an opportunity to play around with sounds? Like Gibson and Levin said to us at the beginning, that children need to know that there is variation and they need to have a strategy to transfer it. How many opportunities for challenge are we granting our students? Are we doing the work? Is the text so easy and predictable that they're not learning the nature of the code and getting enough opportunities to try one sound, and if it doesn't work, try another? And Tim Shanahan was kind of reiterating this a few years ago when he was talking about set for variability. He said, explicitly teaching students alternative pronunciation choices is important, but it is also best not to overuse decodable text with kids. Such text may provide valuable concentrated practice with sound symbol relationship and spelling patterns, but may also mislead students as to how English orthography works. So I don't want that to be like, oh, throw out the decodable text, just like you last year you threw out the level text. No, I think he's saying, and I would agree, it's a continuum, and be aware of how, if you camping out in decodable text for months or years, you may be misleading students as to how the nature of our code and giving them opportunities to practice alternative pronunciation choices. Okay, so I think I should wrap it up. Here's my final message to you. Look for set for variability in action. Your kids are doing it. And make sure that they're reading aloud so you can catch them doing it. Notice, are they good at it or are they not good at it? So, and then do more reinforcing of a set for variability mindset. What else could that be? That's all it is. Maybe this is where I'm getting on my more of the opinion side. Maybe you should release the code earlier, and definitely be coaching set for variability in text, and you should be reading a lot. All right. I took a lot of your time. I hope it was useful. Thank you so much for being here. Email me any questions. If you go to readingsimplified.com/give-feedback, you'll get some of these tips that I have, also with hyperlinks to video examples, and then all the references that I used today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ginsberg. This was amazing. Do you have time to answer a few questions?
I certainly do. I would love to. I'm so into this, as you can see.
So is everybody on the call. So there are a couple I'm going to go a little bit out of order. There are a couple that build on each other. The first question was, how much does students' knowledge, conscious or subconscious, of sound patterns in English play into this? And the second question was, writing on the question above, which I believe is what they're referring to, if students are very weak in introducing many sounds for the same phonograms in early stages, will that be very overwhelming?
Yeah. And did you say, was the second question releasing that information, the different phonograms early on?
Saying if you're introducing many at the same time.
Yeah, right.
Is it just too overwhelming?
Right. For question number 1, the research has really not pinned this down at all. A lot of the researchers are thinking that you have to teach the variation, and that's what's in the Savage. There's 2 studies there, and there's another one elsewhere. They think you have to teach the phonographic, the phoneme grapheme relationships in order for the child to be able to do that flipping. I have observed, so, and then that's just what they kind of are writing in the articles, but there's no studies as far as I'm aware, that kind of says yes or no to that question. Mm-hmm. My clinical observation is that once you give kids that strong sound-based decoding approach, and sufficient phonics knowledge, kind of back to share, they can deduce stuff that you haven't taught them yet. But it's just attention into question 2. So like when I have an absolute beginner who doesn't know any letter sounds, I'm not going to teach them that A can be it can be A, it can be I don't think that's appropriate when they're at that baby beginner stage and they don't even know how to blend 3-sound words and they don't know the alphabet. But then I move them, so it's kind of a phase. So after they can do some of those early things that you need, like in the formula, learn some letter sounds, learn the blending, and we're getting that on, that's kind of underway. Well, then maybe you can add some more complexity, which is when I say in the reading simplified world, move from 3-sound CVC words into advanced phonics. Because you got some stability, like Anne Cunningham said, you have an anchor for how the code works. Now you can throw more confusion into the pot. Now, it doesn't mean it's random. Like our approach is to have sorted, where you teach one sound and multiple spellings at the same time, and you kind of practice that. You don't just move on to a new sound every day. So to the second question, yes, you'd have to be aware of where your kids are developmentally. And I don't think that anyone's saying pour all the phonics sounds on top of them in a week. I'm just saying, don't wait a year.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions just asking a little bit more about how set for variability impacts results when using nonsense words in assessments. That's one question. The second question on the topic was, could you talk a little more about the relationship between SFV and nonsense word reading?
Yeah, so crazy how you wouldn't have expected that when I talk to you about how to change mother to mother, that is going to relate to nonsense words. So I don't know a lot yet still about that question. There haven't been that many studies on it. But here is the study. You can go into looking at Kearns of 2016, Stacy in 2019, and Tumner and Chapman in 2012. I believe they've all found the association between set for variability and nonsense words. And the reason, in my opinion, it's associated is because basically set for variability, remember, it's really tapping something regarding word identification. What is word identification built on? Sound-based decoding, and our best measure of sound-based decoding is a nonsense word test. So I think that's why it's like with the triangle model, as our brains are taking oral language and merging phonemes and graphemes inextricably forever in our mind, that when I say a nonsense word to you, you're still pulling up sound letter strings. Gimbit, you probably are thinking Gimbit, or you're not just thinking what sounds came out. You as a reader, you can't disassociate. So nonsense words are just it's actually very similar. Set for variability being an oral task is a way to measure something that is kind of hidden, that explains something that's going on in the brain that's necessary for word reading in such a way. Like nonsense words, we don't need to teach nonsense words most of the time, but it's a great assessment to show how's the sound-based decoding foundation working. Do they get how sounds and symbols line up? Because that's how they're going to be able to build words automatically. They recognize by sight, orthographic mapping, and become fluent.
Thank you. We'll get a few more questions in, if that's okay. I know people want to go, but I also know people want their questions answered. Is set for variability the same as word attack strategies, such as identifying a smaller, familiar orthographic chunk or linking to a word the child knows?
The emphasis on Lynn, let me answer and let me know if I'm not really getting the question. The emphasis with set for variability is that you should tie the child's focus into print and meaning, but your main focus is on print. So with Patriot, he was needing to look at the symbols, because first he said parrot, and then he had to come up with patriot. So he's very attentive to the orthography. And he realizes that the phonics is wrong. So it's still very much on that triangle model. It's phonology and orthography that's heavily weighting. And then semantics or meaning, vocabulary just kind of comes in and cleans up the situation. It's not the leading player. This is how this Except for variability sometimes is perceived as like 3Qing, but we're turning
Right.
3Qing on its head. Context is the third thing that we kind of lean on. Mostly we're leaning on orthography and phonology, and I think you can see that with those relationship, the correlations. The correlation with phonemic awareness was higher than it was with vocabulary, and word identification,
Right.
which is heavily orthographically determined, is higher than vocabulary.
I think that's so interesting because I think that's why I was so interested, like with the video with him saying patriot and he still didn't know the word. I was like, I remember when I used to work with dyslexic teenagers and I would say, can you make it sound like a word you know? And they were like, I don't know that word. So I always thought it was tied to, I don't know another word like that. And so I always, in my head, it was always more about vocabulary. So that was what it was. It's fascinating that it really, it's not. And I think that's might have been where some other people on the call were like, oh, okay. Because you think it is, because you're saying, could you, you have this idea of it, you're switching it to a word you're supposed to know, but if they don't have the vocabulary, the background knowledge, but the point is that it doesn't matter, right? It's like you're teaching them that flexibility that's not based on
Not
prior,
solely.
no, right, exactly. It's about the orthography,
Yeah,
not
and I
about,
think the one thing that was interesting about that student, the Patriot, so he is a classic dyslexic, strong with oral language and weak with phonological decoding. So you're going to have kids that are weak with phonological decoding and poor with language, and they're not going to be as good as switching into Patriot. And like he did, and you're going to have to do more of those steps like I did. And you're still going to need to build more of their language system. So I don't mean to imply that vocabulary and language aren't a player. It's
sure.
just not preeminent.
Right. I think that's where it was tripping. That's where it used to trip me and my students up, at
Yeah,
least,
it's more
right?
intuitive. And the researchers, our first researchers, they seem to think that it was. Yeah, Gail, I do agree that it was in his oral vocabulary, loosely, like because we have words that we've heard that we don't
Right.
really know the meaning of, but we might know how to pronounce them because we've heard someone say them at some point in time. So our phonological representations are this big, and our vocabulary knowledge is smaller, but they relate.
Okay. Do you have time for one more? Okay. I have students who would say wasp with the short vowel and continue reading, thinking they had read it correctly. I realized this in another subject, but what do I need to do differently so that they are attaching meaning to the words? They
Yeah.
wouldn't realize that the short A version didn't sound right.
Yeah. Well, if you think that they should know that if they're native speakers and they should know that I actually don't know that word, then you want to stop them and hold them accountable for, are you making sense? Reading is not simply just blah, 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 blah. So hold them accountable at the word level. Wait a minute, I don't know the word wasp. Is that a word that you know? Then why did you not stop? Let's stop whenever you make a mistake, and then hold them accountable at the sentence level. What did we just read? And then hold them accountable at the paragraph level and at the chapter level. So it's really important to make sure that you're not letting bad habits run amok. And so I agree. I've definitely seen that. And I think it happens a lot when kids are older and they've had failure for so long that it's actually a very natural, reasonable strategy to be like, I just got to barrel through because nothing's working. But if that's why it's so important for us to be there as the coach and to say, well, what else could this be? And not to let them get away with anything.
Okay, thank you so much. There are other questions. If it's okay with you, Dr. Ginsberg, I can always email them to you and include some of them in the answers when I can do a follow-up email for folks. That
That's
way,
nice then. Yeah.
that would be, that would be wonderful. And there was a question on if you're able to share the slides. So let us know. Yeah. Okay, great. So I'll
Sure.
share those along with the recording. And I will also and I also send some of those questions over. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time tonight. It was very generous.
Well, I'm
Thank
so
you.
glad about the interest. I think we could really
Yeah.
change the field if we understand this theory a little bit better. Do you think there's a way to snag all these questions?
Yes, there
Okay.
is.
Okay.
There is, and I'm going to figure that out.
Thank you, Lynn.
And yeah, I believe, yeah, there's a way to save them, and I'm going to I will do that. But thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to all of you who are watching the recording, and especially to Dr. Ginsberg. It was such an honor. It was funny. I was saying earlier to Dr. Ginsberg, I was like, Lynn Stone really recommended you, but wait, I could have sworn but then I knew there's somebody else where I heard your name, and it was when I attended the Holly Lane session as well. So people were just talking about you all over the place. And it just shows you the impact of your research, especially to have folks like that singing your praises.
It makes me wide-eyed if you're in my shoes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoys the holiday season, and we will see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.